So I understand most cars now don't have CD players.
Yeah.
Ours still does. And I just saw in the news yesterday that Best Buy is phasing out DVDs. I understand. So anyway,
They're getting rid of AM on the radio.
yeah, and I don't like government interference, but I did send an agreement with government action against that. But I really think that people ought to just say, look, if you don't have AM radio on the car, I'm not going to buy it. That would be the market solution. But people are sheep, they'll buy it anyway, probably. Anyway, all that was a long rabbit trail to get to. I have copies of CDs of some really good messages. This one is The Urgency of the Hour by Steve Lawson. Steve Lawson is really good. You'll be excited by him. And then If God is For Us by Sinclair Ferguson. Really good message. And then two from R.C. Sproul, the late R.C. Sproul. One is Human Dignity and the Sanctity of Life. Now, unless you think that's just about abortion, it's not. He goes a lot into what it means that the humans are different than the animals and what human dignity is and how that has changed over the years. And then also The Goal of the Christian Life by R.C. Sproul. Both of those are messages that were given by him many years ago, but they're all good. So if you'd like to take any of these, feel free to do so. And I'm told that Leonard likes to listen to things too, so bring it back and pass it on to him. All right, last time we were together, we were looking at the Black Death or the Great Plague, in which anywhere from 40 to 70% of Europe died. And as we talked then, even and probably as disturbing as that fact was, as people were dying all around, was the fact that no one knew what caused it. Where's this coming from? And the only thing they could be in somewhat agreement was this must be a judgment of God. I think of some of the calamities that have happened in our country in the last couple of decades, and how there have been times when religious leaders have said, this is a judgment of God. He's trying to get our attention. And I wouldn't doubt that. But as a result of the Black Plague, there were some positive things that came out of it. And one of them is in the area of education. Tonight, we're going to begin looking at medieval learning and art. Well, education in the church, and that's primarily where it was till this point, continued in the Middle Ages, primarily among monks under the influence of the Roman Church. And their learning was not just the scriptures. They had a liberal arts curriculum, which consisted of several different things. First of all, there was what was called the trivium. And the trivium has how many parts do you think? Right, okay. You either know Latin or you could guess her. The first one was grammar. So they learned grammar in Latin, no matter what their native language was, because the Bible was in Latin for one thing, and all the words they're saying every week in the Mass or Latin. And Latin was considered, or grammar was considered, the foundation of science. Oh, by the way, I wanted to mention, I just noticed a footnote here of where I got some of this information. If you're interested in reading further about the Black Death, or even about this time period, the 13th century primarily, the standard work is by Barbara Tuchman, which is called A Distant Mirror. I think I've got that right. And I got a lot of information from her, and I found that other places that I read about this time period also got their information from her. So I was reading some of the things I shared with you last week. As I was reading, I thought, that sounds familiar. And then I realized I had read it in Tuchman's book, and the people writing these other articles didn't really give her credit, but a lot of it was from, or most of it was from her. But a classic work. It's kind of thick, and I haven't worked my way all the way through it. But that's the one to read if you want to read more. And who doesn't want to read more about the Black Death, right? So, yeah.
The foundation of science, does that have to do with medicine too?
Yeah, all science. Yeah. Now, to us, studying of grammar may seem kind of dull. Not something to bring scriptural texts to life. But for the medieval student, studying grammar meant more than learning the rules of constructing sentences. Separate schools already existed in churches, especially bishops' cathedrals, we'll talk about that later, to offer free lessons in reading and writing Latin. Higher teachers or masters assumed their students would arrive with that foundation in place. So if you're going to a regular school, they assume you already have grammar as a part of that. And that's why it's the foundation of everything else. Grammar as a liberal art pried deeper into the meanings of words, literary devices, and most important, the moral or ethical lesson flowing from the text. We find that reflected many centuries later in McGuffey's readers. How many of you have ever read a McGuffey's reader or looked at them? Yeah, that used to be the foundation of education in our country. They were used all over the colonies. Written by Charles, isn't it? Charles McGuffey? From right here in Poland, actually. I think, well, I think he was, where was he born? He might have been born, I can't remember where he was born, but I think the school he taught in was in Poland. And they've relocated that building, or at least one of the places he taught. They relocated that building to Greenfield Village near Detroit. So you can see that today. Anyway, he in the McGuffey's readers, it wasn't just stories that were teaching children to read, or that they were reading and learning how to comprehend and all that. These stories had a moral. Sometimes there were stories from the Bible. Oh, can't do that in school today. Sometimes there were Aesop's fables. Sometimes, so they just drew on literature. So not only acclimated students to how to read, and but maybe what to read as well. As an aside, since I'm going down this rabbit trail, it's probably been a couple of decades ago. That's probably at least a couple decades ago. And so I'm sure it's much worse today, that I read of a Harvard law professor. So these are students who have already gone through the bachelor's program. They're now in their doctoral program of law, assigned a reading to them from Blackstone's Law. Blackstone's Law was the law book of England and the colonies. So anybody who was a lawyer knew Blackstone's Law. When Lincoln was studying for the bar, he studied Blackstone's Law. Everybody had to. So he assigned this passage to them to read. And they came back the next day and said, man, Prof, that was really difficult reading. It was hard to get through. We had a hard time understanding it. And then he informed these graduate students that the passage which he had given them, which was a section from Blackstone's Law, he had actually taken from McGuffey's 6th grade reader. That has nothing to do with medieval learning. Well, maybe it has something to do with it. I don't know. So students read widely through the church fathers in these, not in colonial America. Oh, they did that too, but in the medieval education, and the classics, the Greek classics or Latin that we've been reading, and use that learning to understand and digest the meaning of biblical texts. So in other words, the procedure of understanding what the Bible is saying in Latin, if you want to understand that, you read other things in Latin. You read classical literature in Latin. Today, that would entail, if I want to understand the Greek text of the New Testament, you would read classical Greek stories. You would read people like Plato and other things like that. Would give you a greater understanding of language. And so I don't do that. I don't feel like I don't have the ability anymore to go to the Greek and just read it. But when I'm doing a word study, I find out how was this word used by the classical Greek writers. And oftentimes you get a greater sense of what the word then means in the Greek text. So that was the procedure. So that's what is meant by the foundation of science. Because science, not just thinking about biology, things like that, but the science of interpretation. And that is, if you're going to interpret the Bible, if you're going to understand the Bible, you have to approach it in a sense scientifically. In other words, you have to analyze the words, you have to analyze the situations. Anybody who teaches inductive Bible study, how many of you have ever heard of inductive Bible study? All right, that is a method of understanding, interpreting the Bible, and it involves asking the W questions: who, what, when, where, why, and wherefore, or how. Asking those questions as you're going through it means doing word studies. That's the science of it. And when I teach Bible study, I point out that it is a science and also an art, because as you work at it scientifically and develop your skills in that, it becomes an art in that you're able to bring things out and develop them and so on. So for them, grammar was the foundation of learning, maybe would be another way of saying it. Okay, do you have any questions about what I've said about grammar? I lost anybody yet? Second part of the trivium is rhetoric, which is effective speaking, and that was called the source of law, because arguing the law, or I should say approaching the law, is to argue law. It is to talk about what is law. And so an important part of a liberal arts education was, first of all, the foundation of grammar, and then secondly, knowing how to speak effectively, the rhetoric. And then thirdly, there was logic. Logic is that which differentiates the true from the false. Christ is the truth, after all. And so logic is a preeminent Christian liberal art. At least so said Peter Abelard, who we'll come to. Abelard later in life sought to fuse logical study of the faith with a disciplined life of prayer. And sometimes we find that there may be an overemphasis of logic, but I suspect that in the modern evangelical church, there's rather a lack of logic rather than an overemphasis on it. I've heard Christians say so outlandishly illogical things. I'll leave it at that. But these are good for us to consider. And in fact, those who pursue, I know some homeschooling groups that pursue what's called classical Christian education, and they divide up their years not into so much elementary and secondary, but into the years of grammar. I mean, do you remember back years ago, we had what was called grammar school? Anybody go to grammar school? I think they still called it that when I was a kid, even though the emphasis was not what it is now, but that's foundational to understand grammar. And, you know, I suspect that that's no longer much of an emphasis. But then you go to rhetoric, and the classical Christian education has the years of grammar, and then they move on to the years of rhetoric, and then the years of logic. You know, you can't really teach much logic to a 6-year-old. They need the foundation of understanding language first, and the maturity and the years. You know, it's been frustrating to me a number of times to see parents trying to use logic with their child who is being disobedient and trying to explain to them, and the kid doesn't have any idea what they're talking about. But we have to treat children as adults now, and treat them as persons, you know, and all that. I will call it nonsense. But there are different progressions through life, and they saw that as part of their schooling. So these 3 disciplines prepared students to read well, grammar, and to compose and deliver public speeches, rhetoric, and to discern and argue whether statements were true or false. And that would be the logic or dialectic. It might be called as well. That's something that's missing even from the best educational institutions today, and that is being able to discern and argue things. And I'm not sure, having been a teacher for many years, and understanding that when I was teaching, that the best way for students to understand something was to interact with it, to argue one side or the other. But the problem was you would cover only this much of all that you needed to cover if you did that. Now, I tried as a teacher to elicit discussion over issues as we could, as things came up. If there's something that I felt they had enough foundation of facts to logically discuss it in high school, I would do that less in junior high or middle school, and even less in elementary school. But you can do it in different degrees along the way. But that's the best way for someone to learn, and that is to interact with the information and maybe even argue one side or another of the opinions there. All right, any comments or questions? You didn't know you're going to get a lecture in pedagogy. All right, the next part of the curriculum was called the quadrivium. How many parts do you think are there? Yeah. So you guys have learned some grammar along the way. The first part of the quadrivium is arithmetic. They don't call it that anymore. Anybody know why? Why don't they call it arithmetic anymore? What do they call it today? Math. I think arithmetic was too big of a word. They took out the math. I don't know. I'm not sure where that comes from or why they did that. But arithmetic is the foundation of order. Why? Because without numbers, there's nothing. Did you get that? Without numbers, there's nothing. They understood that back in medieval times, in the Middle Ages, something that many of us have more lately arrived at, and that is our whole world is based on numbers. Did you know that? Do you know that when we shot a capsule into space headed toward the moon, that we had to use a lot of numbers to figure out, because you just can't, it's not like driving down the road. You don't go straight, because if you go straight, you're not going to hit the moon because it's not there anymore. A lot of numbers involved. In fact, there was a movie made about that. I think it was called Numbers. Did anybody see that movie? About a lot of the women that were involved in figuring out the arithmetic. Is that called Numbers? Yeah. We're going to talk later about Johannes Kepler. Anybody heard of Kepler? He was a great mathematician and astronomer, and he is the one who, as far as I know, the first one to figure out or try to figure out the where stars and planets would be on certain dates in the future based upon the mathematical equations of their movements. And based on that, also then looked into the past and tried to figure out, for example, the birth of Christ, when that would have occurred and by the movement of the planets. A brilliant man. You understood that the universe was based on mathematics.
So Bill, the difference between arithmetic and mathematics. The branch of mathematics for arithmetic is addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, specifically calculations. Mathematics is the study of relationship among numbers, shapes, and quantities, signs, symbols, proofs, arithmetic, algebra, calculus, geometry, and trigonometry.
So math is the general term
Math is broader,
and arithmetic is more specific.
geometry and
But what kids are learning in elementary school
that's arithmetic,
is really arithmetic,
up to like
hopefully.
fourth grade.
Yeah.
Fifth grade.
Because the next parts of the quadrivium are also part of math, but they're not arithmetic. And the next one is geometry, which is the science of measurement. You probably remember geometry. Everybody take geometry in high school? No, not everybody. The angles and different shapes, rectangles, triangles, so that and the degrees of angles and all of that. So that's measuring. Next was astronomy. You all know what that is. That was considered the most noble of the sciences because it connected with divinity and theology. They saw a close association between the planets and stars and God, divinity, and theology. And then lastly was music. Medicine, though not one of the liberal arts, was analogous to music because its object was the harmony of the human body. So music also is numerical. That's why it fits in here. There are numbers involved in music. I mean, you just even know about the notes. The notes have names that are assigned, or the length of the note is a mathematical. You have a quarter note, half note, eighth note, and so on. So music is mathematical, and even the composing of it is a mathematical process in a sense. And maybe, I don't know, I've never heard this or read this anywhere, but I wonder if that's possibly how Beethoven was able to compose when he was deaf. He knew the relationships of notes, certainly, and maybe mathematics was a part of that. All right, so this was a part of education in the church. This is what monks got if they were educated. Not all of them were, but if they were, this is what they got. The trivium and the quadrivium. Any questions or comments about any of that?
What age did they start?
It for many young men, let's say, or boys who came into the church, they would start as boys. It depended on why they were coming to the church. In other words, was it a family situation? Sometimes a family would dedicate their son to the church for one reason or another. We won't get into all the reasons. I think we've kind of talked about that before. Sometimes a person of their own volition would come to the church and say, I want to become a monk. You think about a guy like even Luther, who had already completed his doctor of jurisprudence and came into the church. So the best answer I can give is it depends. But they had to have that foundation. Now, like in a case like Luther, he already had it because he already went to school.
Right.
And I suppose most adults coming in would have already had it. So this would start whenever a child was able to do it, I suppose.
Being in different times, though, not every person probably went through school.
No.
I mean,
No, this I want to say only. I don't want to use that exclusive a word. I'll say primarily, but I think it's only took place within monasteries.
But
So-
even, like secular type of schooling, is there secular type schooling back then? I mean. is it
Not yet.
mostly monastery?
We're gonna get. I mean, there are probably some exceptions. But we're gonna get to where education becomes more widespread. And again, it's partly a result of long-term a result of the Crusades, short-term a result of the plague. So beginning in the 11th century, the burgeoning merchant class created a market for education that went beyond learning about scripture. So in other words, the increasing number of merchants, and remember, we have an explosion of trade in the 11th century. That created a need for education that wasn't just related to scripture. While theology remained the queen of the sciences, merchants needed other skills, reading and writing, so that they could communicate with suppliers, mathematics for balancing their books. And as supply met demand, then a more public form of education, the university, was born. These are the intellectual centers of medieval Europe. And I don't know how well you can see that, but at least you can see there are a lot of dots on that map. These are the many cities in which there were universities. We'll talk about how that comes about. And let me give you a little bit of a preview of one thing, and that is that whereas the monastic system of education took place largely in remote rural areas, because that's where monasteries were, this new explosion of education is taking place in cities. And that's really what causes it to explode, is that it's in cities where there are a lot of people. And many people are taking advantage of it. So let's talk about what brings that about. The political and economic, first of all, the revival of learning that swept across Europe in the 12th century was brought about by political and economic conditions in Europe, which were improving, producing a climate more favorable for intellectual and cultural pursuits. If people are wondering where their next meal's coming from, they're not worried about reading Socrates. So as people have more leisure, they develop more specific abilities so that they specialize in making things and learn to turn that into trade, which makes them more prosperous, which gives them more time for learning, for creating. And so the economic conditions in Europe were improving. Secondly, Europe's contact with the Byzantine and Arab civilizations, maybe Byzantine is a term not familiar to you, that would be eastern part of the Roman Empire, Greece, over into present-day Turkey, which was Asia Minor, and into the Middle East. And then the Arab civilizations of the Middle East, who had preserved a lot of the Greek literature during the time when Europe wasn't interested, mostly because they were living hand to mouth and living on manors and things like that. But Europe came in contact with these two great civilized areas as a part of the Crusades. And this contact exposed Europe to new ideas. These cultures transmitted to Europe not only their own knowledge, but also the preserved learning of ancient Greece and Rome. New avenues of study opened as Justinian's Code of Laws Justinian, the great Roman. The works of Aristotle especially were attractive. And Greek and Arab medical writings became available in Europe. And of course, they found that in these medical writings, for example, the Greeks and Arabs were far more advanced than anything they had been doing in Europe. You can, if you were here when we covered the birth and spread of the Muslim religion, you may remember that some of what they developed, many of the sciences, and one of them was in the area of medicine and had detailed drawings of the circulatory system, for example, different things in the human body. If you want to, feel free to interrupt any time with any of these points. I won't ask you necessarily, just stop me. The third reason for a revival of learning was the increasing need for education. I've already alluded to that as towns grew and the functions of government expanded, there was an increasing need for education. A theological training was no longer sufficient to meet all the needs of law and business. Greater numbers of people, including some from the rising middle class, were seeking entrance into the ranks of the educated. Again, middle class, you're developing more, people have more leisure, more money, they want to get more educated. Between the 500s and 900s in Western Europe, the Old Testament loomed large in religious consciousness. Not only did the Old Testament furnish examples of a life not dissimilar in many ways to that of medieval life, but more importantly, with the allegorizing of every incident, in other words, taking every event in the Old Testament and trying to make some kind of an example or some kind of a story that fits or some kind of a way of saying, well, this really stands for something else. There was also found the prefiguring of what was to come in the New Testament. In order to facilitate the education of the clergy, Pope Gregory VII issued a decree in 1079 requiring the creation of cathedral schools, not just monasteries, but now in cathedrals. Because, and these schools became more influential than the old monastic schools for what I said before, and that's because they were located in the newly burgeoning cities, and they eventually then developed into what we call universities. After the Viking invasions ended in the 11th century, and again, that creates a sense of peace and security that they didn't have. I mean, you're not going to go studying Greek literature if you're afraid the Vikings are going to come any minute. So as the Vikings ceased their invasions, Western Europe gradually became settled, urbanized, literate, populous, and prosperous. Under these conditions, Europe discovered the Gospels, which resulted in a deep religious change comparable to the Reformers' discovery of the Apostle Paul in the 1500s. I can't tell you I can understand totally what this means. I have a sense of what it is, and that is because if you study Roman Catholicism, you'll see that much of what is a part of the Roman Catholic Church is really relying on the Old Testament. I mean, you got this whole thing about priests and sacrifice and all that stuff. They're not literally sacrificing animals, so they've Christianized it by saying, well, we'll sacrifice Jesus every Sunday. But they're still offering a sacrifice. And so there was this great emphasis on the Old Testament. And the people of the Middle Ages then were drawn to that because they saw the people of Israel in the Old Testament as being like them. And so they followed that. But what we find is that as they become more educated, or educated at all, as they become more literate, maybe I should say, and have more exposure to the Gospels, they find that the Gospels really speaks to them more than the Old Testament does, and beyond what their own church is telling them. They're seeing things, hearing things from the Gospels that are really not a part of what the Roman Catholic Church is communicating. And so the discovery of the Gospels changes the attitudes of people. A gospel-based faith fostered, first of all, an emotional spirituality that slowly flowed through society. The religious, monks and nuns and priests, and the laity yearned to learn more about Jesus, his mother, and his apostles. The new spiritual yearning, coupled with wider literacy, encouraged the use of personal prayer books, like the lavish Book of Hours made for the rich. That's a book that goes through all the hours of a day and the prayers and stuff. And people wanted to have their own personal prayer books, and the many plainer books for the less wealthy. Between the 11th and 15th centuries, hundreds of thousands made the long, expensive, and dangerous pilgrimage to the Holy Land to see those places where Jesus was born and where he suffered his passion and where he died, together with other holy places where he was during his life and after his resurrection. People continue to do that today. We may not call it a pilgrimage because we don't necessarily attach any spiritual significance to being there. We don't think our sins are covered or anything by going there, but there are probably few Christians who at least wouldn't aspire to going and seeing those places. And I can tell you that it is worthwhile. It is not so much an experience that's spiritual, although some have that, but it's an experience which is educational, because you see where Jesus did certain things, or you see the lay of the land, you see what it looked like. And if you come next Sunday morning, you'll see what it was like where Jesus cast the demons out of a man. And I'm so glad to have been there and seen those things. Since Latin was a barrier for most people, vernacular translations flourish. Vernacular simply means common language. Not only the Gospels, but also of the Psalms, which were believed to have been written about Christ. So that's why the Psalms were important. There were devotional tracts written. Sermons of the early church fathers were translated. And even the illiterate had means of learning more about Bible stories through people acting it out, or at least through the pictures in the stained glass windows.
Flannel graphs.
Pardon me?
Flannel graphs.
Yeah, or flannel graphs, yeah. No, sorry, but they weren't invented. Puppets, maybe, but not flannel graph. There were two special days that centered on the human forgiving Christ, which became the focus of the church calendar. Now, take note of that description, the human forgiving Christ, because that's not what you found in most Roman Catholic medieval theology. What was their view of Jesus Christ? He's the angry judge. Jesus is angry with you because of your sin. And so, if you want something, you don't go to Jesus, because all you're going to do is get him to notice you. And who knows what will happen. So instead you go to Mary, because Mary's more sympathetic, and she can go to her son and he'll listen to her. Or you go to one of the saints, which is a substitute for the old Roman gods. You go to them. But during this time period, as there was a greater emphasis on the Gospels, Christ became the focus of the church calendar as a human, forgiving Christ in two different holidays. First, Good Friday, which emphasized the suffering Christ, replacing Easter with its celebration of the risen, glorious, triumphant Jesus, the conqueror of death. So they kind of switched from Easter to Good Friday because of what they saw as the example of the humanity of Jesus in sacrificing himself then, not mass every week and the mumbo jumbo that the priest goes through, which, and yeah, they see Jesus on the cross back there on the crucifix, but Good Friday, it was brought to their attention, the suffering of Jesus, the human being, and his purpose in that. And then Christmas, with the emphasis on Christ's humanity and vulnerability. Think about it. In celebrating Christmas, they were focused on the fact that God took on human flesh, became a human being, but not only that, was placed in the most vulnerable position of any human being, and that is of a baby who's totally dependent on those around him. And it's in this understanding that Francis of Assisi, who we talked about before, created what may have been the first Christmas crèche in 1223 to make real Christ's humanity. People could see that Jesus had been like them, that he had been a real baby. Now, at that time, Mary also grew in prominence as being the caretaker of Jesus, but at least there was this emphasis on the humanity of Jesus, which had been lacking. And then lastly, the discovery of the Gospels brought about a greater concern for the dead. That was another central feature of late medieval religion, and the doctrine of purgatory was very much alive. One person's prayers, alms, or good deeds could literally be donated to another person, including those in purgatory. So the concern for the dead led them to take extraordinary means, whatever was possible, in order to help those friends, those relatives especially, who were suffering in purgatory, to help them get out. All right, any comments or questions about what the discovery of the Gospels brought about in late medieval times? How does that relate to today? Do you think our churches in general, have a good balance of the divinity of Christ and the humanity of Christ? Or do you see it as a pendulum that goes back and forth? How does our understanding of Good Friday and Christmas relate to the humanity of Jesus?
In the broader Christian world, there's definitely been the demytholizing of Jesus and all that, and taking away his divinity and really humanizing him in the liberal, progressive,
Oh, yeah.
Christian wing is just totally, Jesus was,
So he's only human.
yeah, he's just only human.
Mhm.
And that infiltrates in different ways,
Mhm.
when it gets prominent in so much of Christianity that's out there.
Yeah. It's so hard to keep a correct balance in almost anything. When you're thinking about the divinity of Jesus, the humanity of Jesus, they're both true. And it's really difficult for any of us to keep it in balance, because we generally think, when we're thinking of Jesus, we probably are thinking of one or the other of his natures at a particular time, right? And so they had an overemphasis on the divinity. Now they discovered his humanity. And today, there are many who are proclaiming that he was only human. Anybody else? Go to 7:15, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Next, we're going to look at then the universities. All this was leading up to the rise of universities. So they emerged during the 1200s. Why then? Well, it was the end of invasions by the Vikings, but not only the Vikings, but the Magyars and the Muslims. So from all directions, the Vikings from the north, the Magyars from the east, the Muslims from the south and the east. So the invasion stopped. So that there's increasing stability from the larger kingdoms, a revival of trade and growth of literacy, and contact with the Byzantium and Islamic cultures. I've mentioned most of that. The origins and early activities. We'll talk about. The universities grew spontaneously. Basically, people came to listen to a teacher. We'll talk more about that. They started in Italy and expanded north, much like the Renaissance that we'll talk about later. And we'll talk about how guilds developed for instructors and students, partly to protest high rent. There weren't dorms. You had to find a place to live. And because of the demands on instructors, and they were fined if they didn't attend lectures. Here's a painting someone did of a teacher and his students. And just like today, some of them nodded off. Pardon me? He's checking his cell phone.
That's right.
He's cheating. All right, student life was very carefree. Because the universities, as it starts out, weren't really organized like ours today. Basically, like I said, you found it, if you heard of a teacher and you wanted to go sit under that teacher, and you might sit under this teacher and another teacher. And taking 2 classes a week was a full load. You'd have to rent your books, and remember, there's no printing until 1450. So these are hand copied books that you would rent because you couldn't afford to pay for them. You got a BA called the Trivium, so it's following the same guidelines that the monks had. And then your MA was called the Quadrivium in science. You'd have to go 4 more years for a PhD. And I have some other information about that later, with a couple exceptions. And students might wander all over Europe attending universities. And it was such a carefree lifestyle that much of their time was spent wenching and drinking. Sort of like colleges in the 60s. Any comments there? All right. Oops. That's not where I wanted to be. Okay. Okay. I thought I had a slide for what I have next year, but I don't. So you'll just have to listen. I may not have it in the notes either. I don't know. First of all, concerning universities, students were interested in who their teacher was, and they would pay a master teacher to teach them. So they would pay them directly. For instance, students once gathered at the Cathedral School of Paris to hear famous teacher William of Champeaux. This is who lived 1070 to 1122. I'm sure he lived longer than that. That must have been the time he was teaching. He was lecturing on grammar. Abelard, we'll talk about him soon, was one of these students and became a specialist in logic, and he challenged William mid-lecture with difficult questions. Have you ever done that to a teacher? Sometimes William could not give good answers. Abelard scored points against his famous teacher and bolstered his own reputation. Soon after, he started his own school on the outskirts of Paris and drew many of William's students with him. So it was just open like that. If you could gather students, you could be a teacher. Laying rhetorical siege to the city, Abelard debated as if jousting other rival teachers in Paris. He reported success upon success, and after a few years ended up taking charge of the now retired Williams School. Seeing the opportunity, many more masters opened schools in Paris. Abelard's student success encouraged these new independent schools, while his fame drew many students to Paris. This encouraged more teachers to relocate, and soon Paris became home to flocks of students seeking learning. So you see, that's how it happened. As the number of teachers increased in a particular area, the scholars formed educational guilds for privileges and protection. Remember, the guilds were a part of medieval life for some time, and it usually was over particular craftsmen or abilities, so that you would have guilds for, wool makers, a guild for carpenters, and so on. Well, the scholars formed guilds so that they would gain certain privileges and protection. For example, in England, a group of scholars in Oxford established themselves as a universitas, Latin for corporation, redefined elsewhere. This corporation took apprentices, who were the undergraduates, and journeymen, who were partially qualified craftsmen who had achieved the Bachelors of Arts. Masters of Arts served as guild masters and taught the students. So if you had a master's, you could be a teacher. They ruled the guild as regents. They trained students to lead the church, as well as law courts, halls of government, and the trades. So they found useful ways to put this knowledge into practice. As in any other guild, the masters organized the syllabus for training, then examined the candidates, giving those who passed the appropriate gratis or degree in the guild. So you see, that's how it begins to get organized. It's through these guilds. So the teachers are determining the syllabus, what's being taught. They're determining who graduates, all those things. Before there's actually any kind of an institutional structure, this is how it starts. Like any other apprenticeship, if you're being apprenticed to a cobbler or to a wool maker, whatever it was, there was a process which began in adolescence, when you're a young man. And it could take 7 years to complete, during which the student would first gain the degree of Bachelor of Arts before attempting the Master of Arts. Now, if you're in theology, and this may answer the question I've had for many years as to why the number of years it took me to get a master's in theology was twice as much as any other discipline, and that the same amount of time that it takes a person to become a medical doctor, and they're a doctor, I only have a master's. Theology teachers, it was determined then, needed an additional 8 and later 14 years of education. And they also needed to be at least 35 years old. No one could become a Master of Arts without satisfying the examiners of his universitas that he knew this syllable in a disputation held for the purpose. Oral disputation long remained the method of examining a candidate for a degree. Cambridge's Senate House examinations became written papers only in 1828, and Oxford too kept up examination by Latin disputation into the 19th century. The disputation survives today in doctoral defenses, where candidates must answer questions orally, although no longer in Latin, and at Oxford for some undergraduate degree candidates. So if you pursue a PhD today, I think in every discipline I know of, You have to meet before a board of professors, and they will ask you questions about your thesis, and you have to be able to answer them and all that before. Just writing your thesis is not enough. You have to also engage in this disputation. Despite strict university standards for guild membership, would-be students simply arrived and applied to a regent master who would place them on his register, which is the origin of the word matriculation or registering. Any comments or questions about that? Gradually, the term universitas, a Latin legal term meaning a whole, universitas, literally universe is to bring everything into one, came to designate those united for the common purpose of education. Some universities were formed by student guilds, such as at Bologna, and some were formed by a guild of masters, like in Paris. I want to read to you rules for teachers set down by students at Bologna. See what you think about that. What if the inmates were in charge of the asylum? Well, see what you think. A professor might not be absent without leave, even a single day. And if he desired to leave town, he had to make a deposit to ensure his return. If he failed to secure an audience of 5 for a regular lecture, he was fined as if absent. A poor lecture indeed, which could not secure 5 hearers. I mean, think about how that would revolutionize our colleges and universities. If people only took the classes that they were interested in and the professors that they thought would teach them something. He must begin with the bell and quit within 1 minute after the next bell. He was not allowed to skip a character in his commentary or postpone a difficulty to the end of the hour, and he was obliged to cover ground systematically so much in each specific term of the year. What do you think? Sound good? Sounds like these students want to learn, right?
And they're directly paying for it.
Yes,
Yeah,
directly to that professor.
Right.
Yeah, that master.
yeah.
I think today kids take the easiest guy that doesn't expect anything, and teaches them the least.
Yep,
Just to skate through it.
that's one of my complaints where I taught that the last, I don't know, 5-10 years, I couldn't get students to take elective courses because they didn't want to hurt their GPA. And because it might be hard. And so courses that I thought would be good for them, that they didn't take, like speech, that would help them whatever vocation they entered, but they wouldn't take it because it was extra work. Any other comments? All right, here's another description of university life. University life has changed significantly over the years. Early universities had no campuses, buildings, laboratories, or athletic facilities. Classes met wherever the teacher could find a place to lecture. Do you remember on one occasion, the Apostle Paul uses a lecture hall? I can't remember. Do you remember where that is? Was it Ephesus?
It's Ephesus.
Yeah.
It was next door.
So it was next door to the synagogue, I think,
Yeah.
was it? And so that's where he he had to wait until classes were done for the day, essentially, because there were teachers there doing the same thing as talked about here. So anyway, they had to find a place to lecture. All lectures were conducted in Latin. Students sat on the floor, on straw, or on small benches. They took notes on wax tablets or parchment if they could afford it. Few students had textbooks. Books were too scarce and too expensive. Sometimes students pooled their resources to buy a textbook, which they shared. While the academic setting has changed dramatically over the centuries, some things about university life never change. For example, many students will still write home only when they're in need of money. This letter from a medieval student to his parents could well have been written by his modern counterpart. This is what it says. This is to inform you that I am studying at Oxford with the greatest diligence, but the matter of money stands greatly in the way of my promotion, as it is now 2 months since I spent the last of what you sent me. The city is expensive and makes many demands. I have to rent lodgings, buy necessaries, and provide for many other things which I cannot now specify. Wherefore, I respectfully beg your paternity by the promptings of divine pity. I wonder how that would go today. Maybe that's a tactic that students ought to think of using today. Divine pity, that you may assist me so that I may be able to complete what I have well begun. I've started off well, but I'm not going to make it if you don't send me some money. In another letter, a father writes to his son who is away at school. The contents of the letter would not seem out of place in modern society. He says, "It is written, he also that is slothful in his work is brother to him that is a great waster. I have recently discovered that you live dissolutely and slothfully, preferring license to restraint and play to work, and strumming a guitar while the others are at their studies. Whence it happens that you have read but one volume of law, while your more industrious companions have read several. Wherefore, I have decided to exhort you herewith to repent utterly of your desolate and careless ways, that you may no longer be called a waster, and that your shame may be turned to good repute." That's a good letter. If any of you would like to borrow that, just let me know. I'll make a copy for you. And then finally, I'll give you another indication of how things were for this little section called Life on Campus. A medieval student's day usually began at 4 or 5 in the morning, when the watchman's horn resounded throughout the city. After attending Mass from 5 to 6, the student attended classes until 10. Then came lunch, a paltry meal consisting of some beef and thick soup of beef gravy and oatmeal. And students complain today about the food at college. Classes continued after lunch until about 5, followed by an evening meal. Then students studied their notes by candlelight until they went to bed at 9 or 10. This routine was broken by the observance of saints' days and religious festivals when the university was closed. On those days, students could travel throughout the city, play games, and even exercise in areas beyond the city walls. For various reasons, roughly 2/3 of students never completed the 6 years of study necessary to become a teacher. Some succumbed to the distractions present in a city far from home. Paris, for example, had a population over 50,000 and featured numerous taverns where students passed their days drinking and gambling. Prostitutes found many customers near universities too. Boys left home for universities as early as age 12, and they didn't always find a healthy environment in which to learn adult behavior. Jacques de Vitry observed in the 13th century that University of Paris students from different lands were obnoxious and frequently at odds with one another and the surrounding community. He wrote, for example, that, quote, "The English were drunkards, the sons of France proud, effeminate, and carefully adorned like women. The Germans were furious and obscene at their feasts. The Poitevins, traitors and always adventurers. The Burgundians they considered vulgar and stupid," unquote.
Where was this written?
Where? When? In 13th century. So time period we're talking about here. All right. Any comments about life as a student? All right. I'll go through some of the individual universities, tell you a little bit about them. First in northern Italy, the University of Bologna. It's where we get that great meat product that we put on our sandwiches. It was the home to early scholars like Gratian, who organized and ordered church laws and regulations called canon law. Bolognese scholars also revived the study of Roman law. Roman law and canon law served as models for ordered governance and church discipline. Law students went on to rise in feudal and church leadership, drawing on their studies to reform abuses and corruption. More likely to be older and wealthier, these law students had already formed important connections in the world. As a result, the University of Bologna organized itself more quickly than Paris. Being that their students were more mature, lends itself to organization. Bologna's university also looked different because the students ran it. Organized into groups called nations according to their homelands, they elected student officers who gave rules and regulations to their masters, like we read, when classes should run and what books would be taught. The masters functioned like hired contractors. In Paris, it was different. University of Paris, by contrast, was a master's university. For many trades in medieval towns, craftsmen gathered in associations or guilds. Guilds could protect individual craftsmen, as we've learned, win special rights and privileges for them, and set up rules for their trade. A guild could also be called a university, universitas. Beginning in the mid-1100s, masters of schools incorporated informally into such a network. They were more concerned with learning and study than with legal rights and status. No formal founding document, such as a charter or contract, marks the University of Paris's origin. The University of Paris became the preeminent center for philosophy and theology. If you wanted to study medicine, you went to Salerno, which is possibly the oldest university in the Western world, founded in the 9th century. If you wanted to study law, you went to Bologna. But the University of Paris had both a vibrant faculty of liberal arts and a faculty of theology. Here again, as among the grammarians and logicians earlier, the rivalry between these two faculties caused conflict and yet fruitful consideration of the way theology and the Bible relate to human reason. So just like today, students go to certain colleges, universities because of a certain emphasis, and they found that to be true then as well. I want to read a narrative here concerning some students that came to Paris. It was a dark, wintry day when a small boat with a handful of passengers crossed the stormy English Channel, bound for France. It carried John of Salisbury, secretary to Thomas Becket. Remember Becket? The English archbishop, who in a few years would meet a bloody end at the hands of King Henry II. Now, in 1164, storm clouds of conflict between king and archbishop were gathering. Thomas sent John ahead to prepare for his own coming flight from England into exile. Remember that in the movie where he sends some people ahead and he's trying to escape death at the hands of Henry II. Soon John arrived in Paris, where he had studied years earlier, and he wondered at its change. Now, with multiplied schools, he saw a bustling and lively town filled with clergy, teachers, and students hastening to their studies. He wrote that, like Jacob awakening from his dream of the angelic ladder, God is in this place, and I was unaware of it. Interesting, huh? As he gets to Paris, he sees all the hustle and bustle of students and teachers, and he concludes that God is there. And men like Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, and 9 future popes all studied there in Paris. Any comments or questions? Now, next time we're going to be looking at a particular philosophy of education, of learning, called scholasticism. We're going to find out where it came from, what it was, and what influence it had upon learning as we are moving towards the end of the Middle Ages. So let's see next. Will we meet next week?
Yeah.
I'm losing track of what part of the month we're in. Do we meet on the night of the trunk or treat?
Yes, unless the weather's bad.
Okay, oh, that's right. Okay,
Right, and if weather's bad, then we have to move it inside, yeah.
okay. All right, any final thoughts? All right, thanks for coming.